People like to imagine family gatherings as noisy kitchens, children chasing each other through backyards, and grandparents sneaking dessert before dinner. Ours had once looked like that. Years ago, before life carried everyone in different directions, and before silence became easier than honesty. Dad's 72nd birthday was supposed to change that. Emily had insisted on bringing everyone together at Longhorn Junction, an old steakhouse just outside Waco that doubled as a country bar every Friday night. It smelled of grilled ribeyes, oak smoke butter, and spilled beer. Country music drifted lazily through the room while televisions over the bar replayed college football highlights from seasons long gone. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Military timing never really leaves you. I parked my dusty gray pickup beside a row of polished luxury SUVs that belonged to people who cared more about appearances than mileage. My reflection stared back from the truck window. Brown leather boots, dark jeans, a navy button-down shirt. No jewelry except the simple silver watch I'd worn for years. No medals, no insignia, nothing that hinted at the life I'd lived. That was intentional. Inside, Emily spotted me first. "There she is," she called, giving me a quick hug before immediately looking past me. "You came alone." I did. "No boyfriend yet." I smiled politely. "No." She gave me the same sympathetic look she'd perfected years earlier. "You work too much." Maybe. Or maybe I'd simply learned that peace was quieter than explaining myself. Dad was already seated at the long table. His white hair had thinned since I'd seen him last at Christmas, but his shoulders still carried that familiar police officer posture. He stood and hugged me. "Good to see you, kid." "You too, Dad." It wasn't a long embrace. It never had been. Dad loved through actions, not words. Across from him sat Derek Collins, Emily's husband. Expensive watch. Perfect haircut. Tailored sports coat despite the Texas heat. He sold commercial real estate and somehow managed to mention it within 5 minutes of every conversation. He stood with that confident smile people mistake for kindness. "Rachel." "Derek." He shook my hand as though we were negotiating a contract. "I hear you're finally back home." "For a little while." "Retired already, I suppose." He laughed. "Must be nice." I simply nodded. The waitress appeared with iced tea. Menus opened. Conversation drifted toward football property taxes, grandchildren, and retirement plans. Nobody asked what I'd actually done in the Army. They never really had. Years earlier, I had stopped volunteering information. Not because it was classified. Not anymore. Because every answer led to another question I couldn't fully explain. So eventually, people assumed I had spent 2 decades pushing paperwork somewhere behind a safe desk.
It was easier that way.
Dad lifted his glass. "I'm glad both my girls could make it." Emily smiled brightly. Derek squeezed her hand. Dad looked toward me. "And Rachel, well," he hesitated. "She served in the Army for quite a while." That was it. 22 years. Reduced to 1 sentence. Derek leaned back. "Office work." Emily chuckled. "I always pictured Rachel buried under stacks of reports." Dad shrugged. "I never really knew exactly what she did." The table laughed softly. I smiled. Because technically, none of them were wrong. Reports had been part of the job. Just not the part anyone remembered. Dinner arrived. Steak sizzled on cast-iron plates. The smell of garlic butter filled the air. For almost 30 minutes I barely spoke. Derek filled every silence himself. He talked about closing a $3 million deal. About buying a lake house. About his son getting accepted to Harvard Business School. About how discipline in business was tougher than discipline anywhere else. Emily looked at him with obvious admiration. Dad nodded approvingly. Then Derek glanced toward me. "So," he cut another bite of steak. "What do you do now?" "I consult." "For the government." "Sometimes?" He laughed. "Sounds mysterious." "It isn't." "You train people?" "Occasionally." "What kind?" "The kind that ask fewer questions." Emily rolled her eyes. "There she goes again." Dad smiled awkwardly. "You've always been private." "Private." Funny choice of words. I nearly laughed. The waitress brought another round of drinks. The country band started playing in the corner. Conversations around us grew louder. Derek loosened his collar. Beer had made him bolder. "You know," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I've always wondered something." I looked up. "What's that?" "You ever actually serve?" Emily sighed. "Derek."
"What?"
He shrugged. "I'm serious." He pointed toward me with his bottle. "I mean, did you ever really deploy? Or was it mostly office stuff?" I answered calmly. I served. For how long? Long enough? He smirked. Long enough to earn a pension. Long enough to earn a name. That caught his attention. A name? I nodded once. He grinned. Oh, this should be good. Dad looked uncomfortable. Emily whispered, Derek. But he was enjoying himself now. What was it? He laughed. They call everybody something. He pretended to think. Princess. A few people at nearby tables chuckled. I folded my napkin, looked directly at him, and answered with exactly one word. Reaper. Silence. Then Derek burst into laughter. Come on. Emily laughed too. Dad shook his head. You kids? Derek wiped tears from his eyes. Reaper. He slapped the table. I would have guessed, Princess. Then, glass exploded against the wooden floor. Every head turned. At the bar, an older man with close-cropped gray hair had frozen halfway to his seat. His beer pooled around his boots. He stared at me as though he'd seen a ghost. Very slowly, he walked toward our table. His breathing had changed. His eyes never left mine. When he finally stopped beside us, he stood perfectly straight. His voice was barely above a whisper. Ma'am. He swallowed hard. Were you... Task Force 7's Reaper. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The music from the small stage kept playing as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside our corner of the restaurant, time had slowed to a crawl. I remained seated while the older man stood beside our table, his posture rigid, his weathered hands trembling almost imperceptibly. He wasn't looking at my father. He wasn't looking at Derek. He wasn't even acknowledging Emily. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, searching for confirmation he already believed he'd found. I recognized that look. I'd seen it before in veterans who unexpectedly crossed paths with someone from another chapter of their lives, someone they never expected to see again outside a battlefield or a memorial service. I gave him a small nod. That depends who's asking. His expression softened. My name's Tom Harris. He extended his hand. I retired from the Marine Corps 12 years ago. I stood and shook it. His grip was firm despite his age. Good to meet you, Mr. Harris. He smiled faintly. Please. He swallowed. It's Tom. Behind me, Derek laughed under his breath. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Emily nudged him beneath the table. Would you stop? No, seriously, he replied, still grinning. Does everybody in the military know each other now? Tom ignored him. His attention remained on me. Were you attached to Task Force 7 around 2012? I answered carefully. For part of it. His shoulders relaxed. I knew it. He exhaled a breath that sounded as though he'd been holding it for more than a decade. My God, Dad looked from Tom to me. Rachel. You know this gentleman. I don't think we've ever met, I answered honestly. Tom nodded. We never did. His voice carried an odd mixture of admiration and disbelief. But I knew your call sign. Derek leaned back in his chair. Callsign, he chuckled. Sounds like a movie. Nobody laughed with him. Tom slowly turned toward Derek for the first time. You think this is funny? Derek shrugged. I think it's interesting. Tom's eyes narrowed. No, you think she's making it up? Derek lifted both hands. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The air around the table changed. Even the waitress approaching with another basket of rolls sensed something unusual and quietly turned away before reaching us. Dad finally broke the silence. What exactly is going on? Tom looked at me. If you'd rather I leave? You don't have to. I knew where this conversation was heading. And maybe it was finally time to stop letting everyone believe the easiest version of my life. Tom nodded once. When I was a gunnery sergeant, he began, our unit occasionally worked alongside Army personnel. Derek interrupted. So she was Army support. Tom didn't even glance toward him. Not exactly. He continued speaking to my father. There are people you remember because you served beside them. He paused. And then there are people you remember because someone says their name over the radio, and everybody suddenly breathes easier. Emily frowned. What does that mean? Tom smiled sadly. It means help is coming. Nobody spoke. He looked back at me. I never met Reaper. He emphasized the call sign with quiet respect. But every Marine in Western Afghanistan knew that name. Derek snorted. Oh, come on. Tom slowly faced him again. Son. There wasn't anger in his voice. Only disappointment. You've never heard that name because people like her never wrote books about themselves. Derek crossed his arms. So what was she? Tom answered without hesitation. Someone you prayed would be on your side. A strange silence settled over the table. I reached for my iced tea. The ice cubes clinked softly against the glass. Dad watched me with growing confusion. "You never told us any of this." "I never tried." "You never denied it either," he replied. "No." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I guess." He stopped himself. "I just assumed." I smiled gently. "I know." That admission seemed to bother him more than anything Tom had said. Across the room, another veteran wearing a Vietnam cap glanced toward us after hearing fragments of the conversation. He recognized Tom and gave him a nod. Tom nodded back before returning his attention to our table. "I've spent years wondering who Reaper actually was." He laughed quietly. "I pictured somebody about 6'4" with a beard." Emily couldn't help smiling. "I think everybody just did." Tom looked at me. "You always kept your face hidden in the reports." I raised an eyebrow. "You've seen reports?" "A few." "They weren't about me." "They never used names." His smile faded. "But they mentioned the call sign." Derek rolled his eyes dramatically. "This is unbelievable." Tom finally lost his patience. He stepped closer to Derek. "You know what's unbelievable?" The restaurant had become noticeably quieter. Several nearby tables were pretending not to watch. Tom lowered his voice. "That you've spent years sitting across from someone like her and never bothered asking who she really was." Derek scoffed. I asked. "No." Tom shook his head. "You asked questions." "There's a difference." Emily looked at her husband, then at me. "When you said you consulted for the government," I nodded. "I wasn't lying." Dad leaned forward. "So what exactly did you do?" I hesitated. Years of habit don't disappear overnight. Some stories belong to people who never came home. Others belong to families who still believed their loved ones had simply died serving their country. Not every truth was mine to tell. I led people. That was enough. Or at least, it should have been. Tom smiled knowingly. "You also brought people home." I met his eyes. He remembered more than I expected. Before I could answer, Derek laughed again. "Okay," he pointed at Tom. "I've got one question." Tom folded his arms. "Shoot. If she's so important." He gestured toward me. "Why have none of us ever heard about her?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the restaurant. Then back at Derek. "Because the people who chase recognition usually aren't trusted with the missions that matter." That sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Dad slowly looked down at his untouched steak. Emily's confident smile disappeared. Even Derek hesitated before responding. Tom continued. "You know how many medals I've seen hanging on walls? Hundreds. You know how many truly extraordinary soldiers refused to hang theirs." He smiled. "Most of them." The country band finished another song. Applause erupted from the opposite side of the restaurant. It sounded strangely distant. Tom reached into his wallet. He pulled out an old faded photograph. The edges were worn nearly white. He held it toward me. "I've carried this for 11 years. The picture showed 7 exhausted Marines sitting beside 2 armored vehicles somewhere in the desert. Young faces. Dust. Bandages. Tired smiles. One figure stood in the background. Helmet on. Face mostly hidden. Only the shoulder patch was visible. Task Force 7. Tom tapped the blurry figure. "We never knew your name." His voice cracked. "But every man in this picture made it home." He looked directly at Derek. "And that's because she showed up." Nobody laughed anymore. Not even Derek. The confidence he'd carried all evening had begun to crack, though pride still kept him from admitting it. He forced another smile. "So," he shrugged. "How do we know any of this is true?" Tom looked at me, then back at Derek. A slow smile crossed the old Marine's face. "Oh, you'll know." Tom's last 2 words lingered in the air. "You'll know." Derek leaned back in his chair and forced a laugh, but it sounded thinner than before. "I've heard enough war stories to know how they grow with age." Tom didn't react. Neither did I. Experience had taught me that the loudest person in a room usually wasn't the strongest. They were simply the one most afraid of silence. The waitress finally returned with fresh drinks, hesitating as she set them down. She could feel the tension without understanding it. The rest of the restaurant had resumed talking, but our corner remained strangely quiet, as though an invisible line separated us from everyone else. Dad cleared his throat. "So, what exactly is Task Force 7? I looked at Tom. He understood the question wasn't really for him. "It's just a unit I was assigned to for a while," I answered. Dad frowned. "I've never heard of it." "You weren't supposed to." That answer only deepened the crease between his eyebrows. For years he had accepted the simple version of my military career because it fit comfortably into his understanding of the world. His oldest daughter had married well. His younger daughter had spent years in uniform doing something. That something had never seemed important enough to ask about. Now, for the first time, I could see him wondering whether he'd spent 2 decades misunderstanding his own child. Derek wasn't interested in quiet reflection. He hated losing control of a conversation. So let me get this straight. He pointed toward me with his beer bottle. You expect us to believe you were some kind of secret operator? I didn't ask you to believe anything. You certainly aren't denying it. I don't need to. He chuckled. Convenient. Emily touched his arm. Derek, no. He shook his head. I've got questions. Tom folded his weathered hands together. So ask. Derek looked directly at me. Did you ever actually fire a weapon? I answered honestly. Yes. In combat? Yes. How many times? I held his gaze. I stopped counting. The confidence in his smile faded for just a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly. Everybody says that, I suppose. So where? I'm not discussing operations. There it is. He looked triumphantly toward Dad. See, that's the perfect excuse. Tom let out a slow breath. You really don't know when to stop. Derek shrugged. I don't like fairy tales. Tom stepped closer. I don't either. The old Marine's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath every word. You know what I remember? Derek folded his arms. What? I remember hearing one call sign over the radio during the worst night of my deployment. He looked past Derek as though seeing another place entirely. It was just after midnight. The weather was awful. We'd been pinned down for hours. No air support. No way out. The restaurant around us slowly faded into the background as Tom spoke. Even Emily leaned forward. Tom wasn't telling a story for entertainment. He was remembering. I had 19 Marines with me. He rubbed the scar running across his left wrist. 3 couldn't walk. 2 were bleeding badly. We'd already lost communication twice. His eyes became distant. I remember thinking, this is where we're going to die. Nobody interrupted him. I heard our radio operator suddenly sit up. Tom smiled faintly. He wasn't smiling because help had arrived. He smiled because he heard a single word. He looked directly at Dad. Reaper. Dad swallowed. Tom continued. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. We simply started breathing again. A chill traveled through my spine. I'd spent years trying to leave those memories behind. Some never stayed buried. Tom kept talking. We didn't know who Reaper was. We didn't know if Reaper was a man or a woman. We only knew that if headquarters said Reaper was coming, someone had decided we were worth saving. Silence settled over the table again. The clinking dishes from nearby tables suddenly sounded impossibly loud. Emily looked at me. Rachel, were you there? I answered carefully. I've been in places that sounded similar. Tom smiled. That's about as much confirmation as you'll ever get. Derek laughed again, though it sounded forced. Still doesn't prove anything. Tom turned slowly. You need proof. Absolutely. Fine. He reached into his wallet again. This time he removed something much smaller. A worn bronze challenge coin. Years of handling had polished its edges smooth. One side carried the Marine Corps emblem. The other bore a simple engraving. Reaper. Dad stared at it. What is that? Tom held it carefully between 2 fingers. I've carried this since 2013. He looked at me. I wasn't sure I'd ever meet the person whose call sign was stamped on it. Emily frowned. Why would you have one? Tom smiled sadly. Because somebody gave it to me after bringing my men home. I looked away. I remembered that night. Not the coin, the faces, the exhaustion. The helicopters finally arriving just before sunrise. Some memories stayed sharper than photographs. Derek leaned across the table. Anyone could have that made. Tom looked almost offended. You're right. He gently placed the coin in front of Dad. So call the number. What number? Tom flipped it over. Tiny letters had been engraved along the rim. A military verification office. Dad stared. His years as a police officer had taught him how official identification looked. This wasn't something bought online. His expression changed. Just slightly. Derek noticed. Oh, come on. You aren't buying this. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he kept turning the coin over in his hands. Finally, he looked up at me. Rachel, when your mother passed away, you missed the funeral because of work. I nodded quietly. I remember. I was angry. I know. I told people my daughter cared more about paperwork than family. His voice grew softer. You never defended yourself. No. Why? Because I couldn't. Because I had been halfway around the world trying to keep another family from receiving the same phone call ours had received. But I couldn't tell him that then. So I simply answered. You needed someone to blame. His eyes filled with regret. I blamed the wrong person. Across the table, Emily looked stunned. She had never heard Dad admit being wrong. Not once. Derek shifted uncomfortably. For the first time all evening, he wasn't speaking. Tom finally broke the silence. You know what impressed me most about Reaper? Nobody answered. It wasn't courage. It wasn't skill. He looked directly at me. It was that after every operation, she always asked for the names of the people who didn't make it. He paused. She never wanted statistics. She wanted names. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I still remembered many of them. Too many. Tom smiled gently. That's how I knew she was a leader. Not because she gave orders. Because she refused to let anyone become a number. The room fell silent once again. Even Derek no longer seemed eager to argue. But pride is a stubborn thing. He finally leaned forward. So, if all of this is true, he looked directly into my eyes. Why has nobody in this family ever heard any of it? I answered before Tom could. Because none of you ever asked a second question. No one had a reply. No one spoke after my last sentence. Because none of you ever asked a second question. The words weren't meant to hurt anyone. They were simply true. Dad lowered his eyes to the challenge coin resting beside his plate. His fingers traced the worn edge as though he hoped it would somehow explain the daughter he'd spent most of his life believing he understood. The birthday dinner no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a trial where no one had expected the evidence to point back at themselves. The band started another country song, but it sounded distant beneath the quiet hanging over our table. Tom finally looked at me. May I tell them about Ridge 9? I didn't answer immediately. There are moments that never truly leave you. You don't relive them every day. They simply wait, quietly, patiently, until someone speaks a name you've spent years trying to bury. Ridge 9. I closed my eyes for just a second. The smell of grilled steak disappeared. In its place came diesel fuel, burned dust, cordite, and the dry Afghan wind that carried sand into everything. When I opened my eyes again, I gave Tom a small nod. Only what you're allowed to know. He understood exactly what that meant. There were details that would remain classified forever. But the human story belonged to the people who had lived it. Tom folded his hands on the table. It happened during my second deployment. His voice had changed. It no longer carried the easy tone of a veteran sharing stories. Now it carried weight. Our platoon had been escorting engineers through a mountain pass. The intelligence looked clean. It wasn't. He paused. We drove straight into an ambush. Emily covered her mouth. Dad listened without moving. Even Derek leaned forward despite himself. The first explosion flipped our lead vehicle. The second trapped the convoy. We were pinned against a ridge. Tom stared through the restaurant wall as though he could still see the mountains. We couldn't move forward. We couldn't go back. Our communications kept cutting out. He looked toward me. Headquarters finally said one sentence. Hold your position. That's all. He smiled bitterly. Easy words to say when you're not the one taking fire. I remembered that transmission. I remembered reading the coordinates while staring at a satellite map covered in blinking markers. We had less than 30 minutes before daylight. Less than 30 minutes before the enemy would completely surround them. Tom continued. We had wounded everywhere. Our medic had already used nearly everything he carried. I honestly believed we'd never leave that valley. He looked at Dad. Then somebody radioed, Reaper is inbound. Dad frowned. What did that mean? Tom answered without hesitation. It meant someone had volunteered to come. He looked at me again. Nobody ordered her. She volunteered. Emily turned toward me. You volunteered. I shrugged softly. Somebody had to. Her eyes filled with disbelief. But why? The answer came before I had time to think. Because they were ours. That was the only explanation I had ever needed. Tom smiled sadly. We never actually saw her arrive. We just heard helicopters. We heard explosions farther up the ridge. Then everything changed. He reached for his glass of water. His hand shook slightly. Whoever planned that rescue made the enemy believe an entire battalion had shown up. I looked down at the table. It hadn't been a battalion. It had been 12 exhausted soldiers who were just as frightened as everyone else. Fear doesn't disappear because you wear a uniform. You simply learn how to keep walking while carrying it. Tom continued. When daylight finally came, the road out was open. He swallowed. I'll never forget seeing one army officer walking back toward the helicopters. Emily whispered. You. I nodded once. Tom smiled. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. The first thing she asked me was, he looked directly at me. How many didn't make it? His voice cracked. I told her 4. She asked for every one of their names. Nobody moved. Tom rubbed his eyes. I thought she wanted them for paperwork. He looked at Dad. I found out later she wrote letters. Dad blinked. What kind of letters? I answered quietly. To their families. Emily stared at me. You wrote to families you didn't even know? I tried. Why? Because official notifications tell people how someone died. I paused. They rarely tell them who their loved one really was. The memory settled heavily over the table. I still remembered sitting beneath a dim light inside a temporary operations building writing until sunrise. Not reports, letters. Trying to describe courage without sounding rehearsed. Trying to tell mothers that their sons hadn't died alone. Trying to find words that were never enough. Dad slowly shook his head. I had no idea. I know. His voice grew quieter. When your mother got sick, I complained that you never called enough. I met his eyes. I called every chance I had. I know that now. He swallowed hard. I just didn't know where you were. There was no accusation in his voice anymore. Only regret. Across the table, Derek suddenly spoke. So, everyone looked at him. His confidence had faded, but his pride hadn't completely disappeared. You saved Marines, Tom answered before I could. She saved Americans. Then he added something that made the entire table fall silent again. And she carried one of my men nearly 3 miles after he'd been shot twice. Dad stared. Emily's eyes widened. I sighed softly. It wasn't just me. Tom shook his head. The others couldn't carry him. You did. He outweighed you by 40 pounds. I smiled faintly. Adrenaline doesn't care about numbers. Tom laughed for the first time that evening. No, it doesn't. Derek looked genuinely confused now. If all this happened, why isn't there some movie about it? I almost smiled. Tom answered with a gentleness Derek didn't deserve. Because the best soldiers spend their lives protecting stories. They don't spend them selling stories. Silence settled once more. Then Dad did something he had never done before. He reached across the table. Not to shake my hand. Not to congratulate me. Simply to place his weathered hand over mine. I'm sorry. 2 simple words. Quiet. Unpolished. Entirely genuine. For a moment the years between us disappeared. I squeezed his hand. You don't have to apologize for not knowing. He looked directly into my eyes. Yes, I do. Because I should have asked. Dad's hand remained over mine for several long seconds. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no tears running down his face. No grand speeches. Just the rough hand of a retired police officer resting on the hand of the daughter he'd spent years misunderstanding. Sometimes that's all healing looks like. The waitress quietly cleared away our empty dinner plates, careful not to interrupt whatever was happening at our table. She had no idea why the mood had shifted so completely, only that this wasn't an ordinary family dinner anymore. The birthday cake Emily had ordered sat untouched on a nearby serving cart. Nobody seemed to remember it. Dad slowly withdrew his hand. I owe you more than an apology. You don't owe me anything. I do. His voice carried the stubborn honesty I'd inherited from him. I spent years bragging about Derek. He looked toward his son-in-law, who suddenly found great interest in the condensation on his beer bottle. I told everyone what a successful businessman he was. I told everyone how proud I was that Emily had built such a good life. Then he looked back at me. And when people asked about you, he stopped. The silence that followed hurt more than any words could have. Finally, he finished the sentence. I told them you worked somewhere in the army. No one moved. I couldn't explain what you actually did. You never explained it. I smiled gently. You never asked. Dad closed his eyes. I guess I didn't. There wasn't any bitterness in my voice. Just acceptance. For years I'd convinced myself that it no longer mattered. Yet hearing him admit it aloud uncovered something I'd buried long ago. As a little girl, I had wanted nothing more than to make my father proud. Not because he demanded perfection, but because he had always seemed larger than life. When I was 10, he taught me how to ride a bicycle by jogging beside me until I finally found my balance. When I was 14, he spent an entire weekend rebuilding the old pickup I'd eventually drive through high school. When I enlisted at 19, he hugged me once, patted my shoulder, and said, "Make good choices." I had waited for him to say he was proud. He never did. Not because he didn't love me, because neither of us knew how to say those words. Tom quietly reached into his jacket pocket again. "I've been carrying one more thing." He carefully placed a folded envelope on the table. It was old. The edges had yellowed with time. My handwriting covered the front. I stared at it, stunned. "I thought that was gone." Tom smiled. "I almost lost it twice." Emily looked confused. "What is it?" Tom unfolded the paper with remarkable care. "It's the letter she wrote after Ridge 9. Dad looked at me. "You kept writing to families." Tom shook his head. "No, this one wasn't for a family." He looked down at the page. "It was for us." He began reading. "To every Marine who walks away from this mountain," his voice softened, "don't waste the life someone else didn't get to keep." The restaurant around us disappeared. I remembered writing those words under a dim tactical light with dust still clinging to my boots. Tom continued. "Go home. Hold your wife longer than usual. Tell your children the stories that make them laugh. Visit your parents before you think you have time." The people we lost today would trade anything for one more ordinary afternoon. Tom stopped reading. His eyes glistened. "I've carried this letter for 11 years. He folded it again. "When I came home, I quit postponing life." He smiled toward a framed photograph in his wallet before opening it. My granddaughter. A little girl with missing front teeth grinned back from the picture. I would have missed all of this. He closed the wallet. If Reaper hadn't reached us. Emily quietly wiped away tears. Dad stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. Not as the quiet younger daughter. Not as the army officer. Simply as Rachel. The room remained silent until Derek finally spoke. His voice had lost every trace of arrogance. "I owe you an apology, too." Nobody answered. He swallowed. "I've spent years making jokes. I thought—" He looked embarrassed. "I honestly thought you exaggerated your service because you wanted attention." I couldn't help smiling at the irony. "I've spent 22 years trying to avoid attention." He nodded slowly. "I know that now." He hesitated before continuing. "You know why I kept making fun of you?" I waited. "Because every time the family talked about you, nobody knew anything." I filled in the blanks. That answer surprised me. It wasn't cruel. It was simply honest. I nodded. "That's usually how misunderstandings begin." He looked down. I should have asked instead. "You should have." Another long silence settled over us. This one wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Dad finally stood. Everyone looked at him. He picked up his glass. "I planned on giving a birthday toast." He smiled faintly. "But I think I owe someone else a few words instead." He turned toward me. "When Rachel was born, I promised myself I'd protect both my daughters." His voice trembled. "The truth is, one of them spent her entire adult life protecting people I'd never meet." He raised his glass. "And I never once thanked her." Emily stood. Then Tom. Slowly, everyone around the table rose to their feet. Even Derek. Dad looked directly into my eyes. "I'm proud of you." The words landed harder than any medal I'd ever received. Because I'd stopped expecting to hear them years ago. For a moment I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know what to say. Because the little girl inside me, the one who'd waited outside Little League games hoping Dad would notice she'd hit the ball farther than the boys, finally heard the sentence she'd carried in her heart for more than 30 years. I smiled. "Thanks, Dad." He nodded once. "You earned that a long time ago." Tom quietly picked up the challenge coin from the table. He looked at me. "I think it belongs with you now." I gently pushed it back toward him. "No, you've carried it farther than I ever did." He smiled. "I'll keep it. For the next Marine who thinks heroes always look like the movies." Outside the restaurant windows, the Texas sky had turned deep orange as the sun settled beyond the fields. The birthday candles were finally lit. Not because anyone remembered the cake, because for the first time that evening, our family had something real to celebrate. Life has a strange way of testing whether forgiveness is real. It's easy to forgive someone during an emotional conversation. It's much harder a week later after everyone has gone home and ordinary life begins again. The Monday after Dad's birthday, my phone rang just after 8 in the morning. His name appeared on the screen. He almost never called first. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, kid." There was an awkward pause. I was wondering, his voice sounded almost hesitant. "Would it be all right if your sister Derek and I drove out to see your place?" I looked through my kitchen window toward the pasture behind my house. 3 horses wandered lazily through the morning fog, while a pair of deer disappeared into a line of oak trees beyond the fence. Of course. You sure? I wouldn't have said yes if I wasn't. He laughed quietly. I suppose that's true. We'll be there around noon. I'll make lunch. When I ended the call, I stood quietly for a moment. For years, nobody in my family had shown much interest in where I lived. They knew I owned a place outside town, but I had never invited them over and they had never asked. Not out of resentment, simply because we'd all grown used to living separate lives. Perhaps that was finally changing. Around noon, I heard tires crunching over the gravel driveway. Dad climbed out first, followed by Emily and Derek. Dad stopped walking almost immediately. This, he slowly turned in a circle, is beautiful. The ranch wasn't extravagant. It wasn't the kind of property people bought to impress strangers. It was peaceful. Nearly 50 acres of rolling pasture, old oak trees, 2 horses, a restored red barn, and a modest white farmhouse with a wide front porch. The only sounds were birds, distant cattle, and the wind moving through the grass. Emily smiled. You never told us you lived somewhere like this. You never asked. She laughed softly. I deserved that. I hugged her. No. You deserved honesty. She hugged me tighter. We're working on that. Derek walked toward the barn. I figured you'd have some tiny apartment near a military base. I did. For a lot of years. He nodded. I guess I never imagined what came after. We spent the next hour walking around the property. Dad stopped every few minutes to admire something. The restored tractor. The vegetable garden. The woodworking shop behind the barn. You built all this? Most of it. When? Weekends? He smiled. You always liked fixing things. I learned from someone. He looked away, pretending not to smile. We ate lunch on the porch. Nothing fancy. Smoked brisket. Potato salad. Sweet tea. For the first time in years, conversation felt easy. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was trying to win. Halfway through lunch, the sound of an engine echoed down the gravel road. A dark government SUV approached the house. Derek looked at me. You expecting company? I forgot they were coming today. The SUV stopped near the porch. 2 uniformed army officers stepped out. Both wore service uniforms with rows of ribbons across their chests. One was a full colonel, the other a lieutenant colonel. They walked toward the porch with practiced confidence. The colonel smiled the moment he saw me. Good afternoon, Major Morgan. I stood. Colonel Hayes. He extended his hand. It's good to see you again. You too, sir. He noticed my family standing nearby. I hope we're not interrupting. Not at all. The lieutenant colonel handed me a leather folder. Just needed your signature. I signed the document without reading more than the first page. Routine consulting paperwork. Nothing dramatic. When I handed it back, the colonel looked toward Dad. You must be Rachel's father. Dad nodded. I am. The colonel smiled warmly. You should know. He paused for a moment. Your daughter trained some of the finest soldiers I've ever commanded. Dad didn't know what to say. The colonel continued. I've served for 31 years. I've met many exceptional officers. Very few earned the respect she did. Then something happened that completely caught my father off guard. The colonel stepped back, came to attention, and rendered a perfectly sharp military salute. So did the lieutenant colonel. Instinct took over. I returned the salute. Neither of us spoke until the colonel lowered his hand. It was an honor serving with you, Major. The honor was mine, sir. The 2 officers climbed back into the SUV and drove away as quietly as they had arrived. Nobody on the porch spoke for nearly a full minute. Finally, Dad broke the silence. I've seen soldiers salute officers before. He looked at me. I've never understood what it really meant. I sat back down. It isn't about power. What is it about? Respect. He slowly nodded. I think... His voice caught for a second. I finally understand. Later that afternoon, Derek helped me repair a section of fence damaged during a recent storm. For the first 20 minutes, we worked in silence. Then he finally spoke. I've been thinking about something. What's that? That night at the restaurant. I waited. When I called you Princess, he shook his head. I thought I was being funny. You were trying to get a laugh. I was. He drove another fence post into the ground. I embarrassed myself. You embarrassed both of us. He sighed. I know. After another long silence, he looked over at me. So why didn't you just tell me to shut up? I smiled while tightening the wire. Because people rarely learn anything when they're being humiliated. They learn when they're allowed to hear themselves. He laughed quietly. I definitely heard myself. I know. He extended his hand. No more jokes. I shook it. No more assumptions. As the sun began setting, Dad walked onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to me. We stood together watching the horses graze beneath the fading orange sky. You know, he said quietly, when you were little, you used to salute me every morning before school. I laughed. I remember. I always saluted back. You did. He smiled. I didn't realize one day I'd be the one most proud to return it. He slowly straightened his shoulders. Old habits from decades as a police officer returning without thought. Then with calm dignity, he raised his hand. A simple salute. Not because regulations required it. Not because cameras were watching. But because respect had finally replaced assumption. I returned it. Neither of us needed words. Some moments are too meaningful to interrupt. If this story reminded you that the quietest person in the room may be carrying the greatest burden or the greatest courage, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs that reminder today. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and whether you've ever discovered something surprising about someone you thought you knew. Your stories matter too. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family honor, second chances, and unexpected truths, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey we share together.